And I have a YouTube channel called Forest County Outback, and I do videos about the Forest County area and the history of what went on here, and I go out to the sites and video them, and that's kind of my thing. Now this is called Stemwinders in the Big Woods. Stemwinder was a term that was applied to a geared steam locomotive. And these were a specialized locomotive, and they were what enabled lumbermen in the 1800s and up to 1920 to get up and down every mountain in this region and in and out of every hollow. Now there were several companies that built these locomotives, but the three ones that dominated the market were the Shays, the Climaxes, and the Heislers. And if you could go back, transport yourself back 120 years to 1900 or so, these are the locomotives that you would have found chugging up and down every hollow and every ridge of this area. At one time, northern Pennsylvania, and particularly Forest County, had the highest concentration of railroads in the state of Pennsylvania. This was an industrial forest. Now, when the first settlers got here in the early 1800s, this is a landscape they found. This was a pine, hemlock, old-growth forest. So think of Hart's Content Scenic Area, Cook Forest, the Tionesta Scenic Area. Those are remnants of the original old-growth forest. That is what they found here. And lumbering became one of the earliest occupations. And when I say lumbering, that means cutting the trees, skidding them to the mill, processing them into lumber, and moving them downriver to market. Now at that time, this industry was very much tied to water. They were water-powered mills, and the transportation system were the bigger streams and rivers. There were no roads here worthy of the name, and of course railroads were decades into the future. And the mills were small. This actually happens to be the Fraser Mill over at Clear Creek State Park. And just as a side note, this arrow here, that designates where there was a blacksmith shop there, and there's an archaeological dig that I go and work on there. And that's coming up June 22nd, I think. I don't remember. But anybody can show up and volunteer on that dig. But they were low production mills, single blade up and down sash mills. I've heard them referred to as primitive, but in 1800, this was high tech stuff. So, but as a result of this, the lumber output was low. One of the bottlenecks was getting logs to the mill, and they were skidded by horse or oxen, and that they had a limited range where that was effective. And usually the practice at that time was to cut and skid the logs during the winter when they had snow to help ease the process. And they could skid some pretty good size loads. These guys, of course, the winters were a lot harsher then, and they did ice roads. These were the ice road truckers or teamsters, whatever. But it was an inefficient process. What would happen is you cut and skid your logs in winter. In spring, mud season, you sawed your logs up. When you were done with your run of logs, you shut the mill down for the year. So a lumberman had a big investment in a plant that sat idle a good part of the year. So one of the first solutions they tried were horse-drawn trams. They were, in this case it was poles, but usually wooden rails, and the wagons or cars were pulled by horses. And it helped ease the problem, but it didn't solve it. See, they also used oxen too here, right? That's something. Everybody pictures horses, but the oxen were used quite often too, and they were actually better at pulling than horses. So, as the 1800s progressed, a lot of lumbermen realized that a steam-powered railroad was going to be the solution to their problem. However, the specialized locomotive they needed didn't exist. These were the type of locomotives they were direct drive, rod connected. And they were limited in their capacity. They could only handle about a 2 to 4% grade before they started losing traction. And since all the axles were mounted on this rigid frame, they couldn't do sharp curves. Curves had to be very wide and sweeping. And so there were a few cases where a rod locomotive worked if you had flat terrain, and this was actually, I think this was Minor and Green. This was taken over by Marionville, where the terrain is pretty flat. And there were several of these. These were built by H.K. Porter in Pittsburgh. And they were built as an industrial locomotive for use around mines, steel plants, mostly for steel plants. But they worked to a degree on logging railroads. And these were saddle tank locomotives. This here was the water tank here. And they were just, I don't know, they were just the cutest little things. And yeah, happy dog. So, and this was, I believe this was Wagner, this is Minor and Green's. The first one was Wagner and Wilson. They had the extract plant over by Marionville. But, like I said, these worked, but they were limited. They couldn't really get into the rough terrain, and the track that they had to run on. Logging spurs were temporary. They would only be there for a couple months or something, so they couldn't grade. They couldn't do a lot of grading. I mean, it's quick and dirty, and you can see, believe it or not, a locomotive could run on that track. Not a rod locomotive, but a geared locomotive. That was the kind of track they had to handle. And steep grades, I mean, you see how rough this track is. Steep grades, very tight turns. That was the locomotive that they needed. And like I said, up until the 1870s, that locomotive didn't exist. So, and this is an example of the real quick construction that they did. These are stringer roads. These were real popular. A lot of times, if you're going up a hollow around here, most hollows have a railroad grade up there. A lot of times you won't see one, probably because they had that kind of construction. When it was torn up, there was no sign left of it. Okay. See, and this is another cheap rail. They just use logs for ties, no ballast. A heavy rod locomotive wasn't going to work on that track. And this was a stringer road with planking. This was actually taken up by Fool's Creek. This is a Teddy Collins operation. And the bridges were pretty flimsy too. Like I said, everything was quick and dirty.
Where's that one at, Terry?
That's not local. That was taken down in near Greenbrier, West Virginia. But it was a good example of the really cheap, quick construction, and it probably took a lot of nerve to drive a locomotive across there.
What gauge rail were they using?
Logging railroads were usually narrow gauge.
You what, 3 foot?
Yeah. because that aided with the turns and that.
My great-grandpa had a picture of a steam locomotive falling through the bridge at Endeavor Lumber Company.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
he had
I've seen
sent
that.
it in to Pioneer Steam and Gas Engine Society in the 80s.
Yeah.
And the letter was at my grandma's house. The letter in the picture was there. It's gone. I don't know who has it,
Yeah.
but I wasn't able to secure that. But
Yeah, I've seen that photo. It's out.
Yeah.
It's out there in the whatever. Yeah, another one. Yeah. So lumbermen at this time had to be pretty resourceful and inventive. So in the 1870s, there was a lot of experimenting with homemade locomotives, and this was something cobbled together from whatever pieces they could find laying around. Okay. And yeah, most of them didn't work. This one, we're not sure if this was a homemade one or this might have been an early Dunkirk. That was another manufacturer. They didn't last too long, but it's uncertain if that's homemade or that actually is a manufactured locomotive. But so a good example of this experimentation was done by a lumberman named William Sykes, who had an operation over near Emporium, and he cobbled together this locomotive. It was called Old Barney, and these experiments kind of all went to a type. It was a flat rail car with a vertical boiler mounted on it, and Barney worked pretty good when it worked. Okay, the key phrase is when it worked, because the problem they were running into is how to transfer the power to the axles. And they used belts, they used leather belts, they used rubber belts, and chains. And Sykes used chains on this, but the quality of chain available at that time was not very good. Chains wore out quickly, they broke a lot, so this thing had a lot of downtime. But it was effective enough when it was running. He kept fooling with this thing for years and years. So this was his second creation. He came to the conclusion that he needed a bigger locomotive. Now he didn't build this one, he just drew up the plans. He didn't have the capability, the sawmill, to do this. He took this to Struthers Wells. And he thought he had a winner with this thing, and so did Struthers. They promoted this thing, tried to market it, never got an order. They were still using the chain drive, and this one, and another photo, this one was called Clyde. And what's interesting about these is, as Sykes moved from job to job, he dragged these things along with him. And they eventually ended up at Clear Lake Lumber in Conifer, New York. It's in the western Adirondacks. They were put in a shed for storage and forgot for about 60 years. And when the plant had eventually closed down and they were cleaning it up and scrapping everything, they found these. And they thought, well, that's neat. Get the cutting torch. They scrapped it. And the owner later said that was something he always regretted. These would have been a fantastic example of that kind of innovation and experimentation that was going on at that time. So the first person to get a effective logging locomotive to market was this guy, Ephraim Shea. And he had begun experimenting about 1872 with this. He was a Michigan lumberman, by the way. And he did the whole thing, the belts, the chains, and nothing worked. So the consensus was finally coming around to what they needed was gears. They needed to transfer the power with gears. And he finally put together a Shea. Now, this is what the Shays eventually looked like. The first Shea looked nothing like this. It looked like this. Okay. this was his first creation, and this was the first one that they were able to put on the market. And vertical boiler, water tank over here, and here's the engine. And on a later one, this was a center mounted, but on the later ones, the shades would be mounted on the right side, and that made them very distinctive. You had the engine and the gears on one side, on the right side of the locomotive, and then the boiler was offset to the left to compensate for the weight. So this was the engine that Shea came up with, and he took this to a guy named William Crippen, who had a foundry and a machine shop, and Crippen built this engine for him. And the interesting thing about this is this same basic engine, it was on the first Shea and it was on the last Shea in 1945. They upgraded it, they did improvements and this and that, but the basic design was still being used on the last locomotive. I think that's pretty interesting. So
They've evolved about 60 years then from those first ones you showed
Yeah.
us?
yeah, I mean they improved it, but
Yeah.
but the basic
But the evolution of it all.
yeah, the basic design was the same. So I mean he came up with a pretty effective thing there. So anyhow, Shea he started using his locomotive, and he really proved the whole idea that the steam locomotive was the way to go once and for all. He had been selling pine lumber for $3.50 per 1,000 board feet. Okay, that's per 1,000 board feet. Think about that next time you're in Home Depot buying a 2x4. Right?
That much a foot that day.
Yeah. So a couple months after he started using this, he was selling his lumber for $1.25 per 1,000 board feet. That much of the price had been involved in just getting the logs to the mill. Yeah, whoops, okay, getting a little ahead here. Okay, so he used this a couple months, and he had some changes he wanted to make. He took it back to Crippen. And Shea really, at this point, did not understand what he had created. Okay? He was trying to keep this thing quiet because he wanted to get a jump on all the other lumbermen, right? So he was keeping this thing under wraps. Well, when he took this back to Crippen, he found out Crippen had been building these and selling them, and he had like a 6-month backlog of orders, and he told Shea, I can't help you, right? And that finally began to dawn on to Shea that what he really had here. So he took it to Lima Manufacturing in Lima, Ohio. It was they built sawmill equipment, and he had a business relationship with them, and they agreed to do the changes, and then this was their upgrade, and they began to market this. And Shea finally realized he needed to get a patent on this thing, so he hurried up, he got a patent on it, he licensed it to Lima in return for stock and royalties on the locomotives, and that was the end of his involvement with this locomotive. They kept the Shea name, but any improvements, any redesigns, he had nothing to do with. He was just sitting back and let the money roll in. So, now the next person to get one on the market was this guy, Charles Darwin Scott. He was a lumberman from Spartansburg, and he kind of had the same, went through the same thing Shea did. And yeah, let's see. Okay, Shea got his on the market. I got a lot of dates, and I'm getting old. I can't remember them. 1881, Shea got his on the market. So Scott got his. They started manufacturing his in 1888, so there was a pretty good gap there. Now, like I said, his journey with developing the locomotive was very similar to Shay's, but the outcome for these two guys eventual outcome could not have been more different. Scott's locomotive, which would be called the Climax, it involved Climax locomotive works, some world-class backstabbing, Dunkirk Engineering, which was another manufacturer, Charles Heisler, who was the designer of the third locomotive, the Heislers, and the United States Supreme Court. Okay. Scott had three disadvantages. He had a trusting nature, he had a limited education, and he had a brother-in-law named George Gilbert, who was a design engineer and a lawyer. Okay. So when Scott went to do the patents, he was overwhelmed by the process. So brother-in-law helpful George said, "Hey, I'll take care of it for you." Well, he did. He got the patents in his name, no mention of Scott. He stole Scott's invention. And he went to Climax in a quarry, and they started building them there. Well, the Shays the Climax at this point did have one major flaw. It was a, let's see. Okay, yeah. So this was a later Climax. Again, the original Climax did not look anything like it. This was Shay's. This was Scott's first Climax. Very similar to the Shay, except his was a center drive. He had a drive shaft down the middle. Okay, that's the Shay engine. Climax engine, similar to Shay. Okay, so he had a center drive shaft here, and gears worked off of that and powered the wheels. The fault, though, was he put a differential like you would have in a truck in there to send the power to each wheel. And it was called a loose wheel arrangement because it allowed the wheels on the same axle to rotate at different speeds. Wasn't a problem on straight or gently curved track. When you got into a tight curve, this thing would lose power. And it was a major problem. So the president of the Climax at that time was a guy named Rush Battles. And he was an engineer too. He fixed the problem. Okay, he redesigned those axles, and he solved the problem. And he took a patent out in his name, no mention of Gilbert, no mention of Scott. Okay, so let's see. Oh, this is Corey in the early 1800s or 1880s. And this would be the first Climax. This was the Climax A. Like I said, they had the vertical boiler, the motor, water tank back here, but you had a center shaft. And okay, where were we? Yeah. So this is a later photo of a Climax. They were very popular. They had a big roomy cab. The guy on the left is Charles Scott. So, okay, we're getting a little bit ahead. Okay, so anyhow, Rush Battles now controlled the Climax patents, and left Gilbert got a bit of a payback here. So he took his patents and his drawings, and then in a snit went to Dunkirk Engineering and asked them to build what would be called the Gilbert patent locomotives. And they were very similar. They were very similar to the Climaxes. Oh, and this, by the way, this was a Dunkirk themselves had been building had dabbled in building geared locomotives. This was one of theirs. It wasn't successful. Their line did not.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh, okay. So Gilbert went to Dunkirk, and they started building his locomotives. And he built a Climax A, or I mean a Gilbert A, very similar to the Climax, except it had that loose wheel arrangement. Yeah, so. So Gilbert also designed a Class B, a larger locomotive, and he changed the cylinder arrangements on it, and he used this inverted V, and the drive shaft came through here. At that time, there was Charles Heisler was working at Climax, Climax. I keep getting confused. He was working at Climax also. He was designing the Heisler locomotive, and he had this same arrangement. So, yeah, who stole what from who here? Yeah, okay, this should have been different. Yeah, it should be up, but this is where the picture of the frame. That's where the cylinders were. So this was Gilbert B. The difference between them is on Heisler's, the cylinders were out here. On the Gilbert, they were inside the cab. Now the problem with the Gilbert was it had that loose wheel arrangement. They only made about 50 units, and people quit buying. They lost interest in them because they had that fault. And this would eventually drive Dunkirk Engineering into bankruptcy. So Charles Heisler, he had designed a Heisler. The first Heisler was built at Dunkirk. He offered Dunkirk the patents. They said, no, we're going to build the Gilberts. So he left Dunkirk looking for a manufacturer for his locomotive. This was the first Heisler. You can see this. Here's the cylinders. That was built at Dunkirk, but that was the only one that built. So he found Stearns Manufacturing in Erie, and okay, getting ahead of things. Okay, I'm getting ahead of things here. So they took over. They took the patent. They built the Heisler locomotives, and the Heisler came onto the market late. This was in 1892. So it was a little bit late in the game here, but these were a very successful locomotive. The Shays and the Climaxes had been designed primarily by lumbermen. Heisler was a trained mechanical engineer, and he did a lot of improvements on this thing, and we'll get into that later. But these were a very good locomotive. So the Shays, they went through an evolution. Okay, this was one of the first Shays, and the whole line all the way through, they carried the engine on the right hand side. But the first ones, the A's, Shay A class, were vertical boiler. And then they eventually went to a T boiler, which meant the boiler was still vertical, but the tubes were out here. And this was the Iron City Railroad over by Blue Jay. So the Shays, were the most popular. They were built from 1880 to 1945. There were 2,700 and something units built. 2,761. Yeah. And it had three classes, like the A's were up to 13 tons, and the B's up to like 30 or 40. And then they had a C, which is a three truck locomotive. It was heavier. You didn't see those around here because, you know, the rails, you know, logging spurs around here were pretty tight, very cheaply built. The Class Cs, they were more used in like mining and quartering and things like that. So most of the locomotives you were going to see around here would have been smaller units like this. And this was, I think this is a 60 ton. But the problem with the Shays, well, it really wasn't a problem, but well, sort of was. So you had the engine over here, and you had the drive shaft on the outside here. And that turned, the, okay, here. So you can see you had all the exposed gearing. That was extremely dangerous. Those got a lot of guys. There was a Brakeman 1888 up at Wheeler and Duesenberry up in Hickory. Brakeman named Ed Witherall. He slipped, his leg got caught in there. They had to dismantle that drive shaft, that whole thing, to get him out. And he actually died of his injuries a few hours later. As an aside, this guy right here, this guy's name was Philip Babb, and he was a brakeman on here. And a few months after this photo was taken, his train was going up Lamentation Run, and had the same crew, the whole crew was the same guys. So at that time, only the locomotive had air brakes. The log cars had a handbrake, had to be set by hand. So they stopped at Lamentation. They're going to head on up. So Philip had to go down along the cars and release the brakes. And he gives the signal, go ahead. They start up Lamentation, and he started making his way from car to car back towards the engine. And along the way somewhere, slip, trip, whatever, he fell. And he fell between the cars and was run over. When the crew got to him, he was still alive. They put him in the cab and beat feet back down to the junction in Janosik Creek as fast as one of these would go, which was about 15 miles an hour. Stopped to use the phone, call the depot in Kellettville and tell them what happened, and tell them have the doctor meet them at the depot. And he never made it. He died on the way. And
Was he 17 years old?
he was 19.
19.
He was 19 years old. Yeah, that's uptown. That's Town Line Cemetery. So,
Terry, what did those weigh on average? You were talking tonnage, is that what they could haul, or was that the?
that was the weight of the locomotive.
That was the weight.
Yeah, and
And they were only doing this without winter, and they weren't doing it in the winter.
no, the trains ran all year round.
They were all year round.
Yeah, in fact, when Philip Babb was killed, that was like late November, so it's probably ice or something on the cars, and I just threw this in because I really like this photograph. This is on the Tonastra Valley Railroad. This is the Big Fill, and they filled this trestle in later with dirt. And if you go down there, the trestle was still underneath it. There's this big embankment going across this hollow, and there's pieces of that trestle that's eroded. Pieces of the trestle is still sticking out of there. I think that's just a neat photo.
It is.
So, climax. This was the shop in Corey, and there is still one building left from that complex. And they built about 1,100 units. and that's some of the shop crew. That's the engine for the Climax. I think I showed that already.
Is that 2-cylinder?
Yeah, that's the engine for the Climax A. Okay. Now that had the center shaft. So the A was a flatbed car with this engine mounted, and it went down through the floor of the car to connect with the drive shaft. So, yeah, this is a vertical boiler engine back here.
Isn't there a group in Corey that's trying to
Yeah.
reconstruct an A or something?
I'm going to talk about
Okay.
that. I will talk about that later. Yeah, yeah. So eventually they went to, like the Shays, they went to the T boiler, and these were lightweight. These went up to, I think, 20 ton. But they were very popular because you had a nice roomy cabin. Everybody could get out of the weather. And they made the A's right up until the end of their manufacturing. So, they built a bigger locomotive, a Class B, and those started at they started at 17 to 62 ton. Now what they did, okay, so they had a vertical boiler. They put steam cylinders out here. Now the first B's, the A's also had a 2-speed transmission. That was kind of unusual. Now they tried that when they enlarged and went to the B's. The first couple had that 2-speed transmission. It didn't work. They took it out. But they also had horizontal cylinders. What they found out was the cylinder stroke was not long enough, so they went to the inclined cylinders, and that's how you can spot a Climax from a distance. But you know, the center drive under here, and this is all exposed. These things, the gearing on these things is all exposed. You know, you slap at the beginning of the day, you slap grease on it. You ran it a while, stopped, you slap some more grease on it, and you kept doing that all day, because there was nothing to keep out dirt and debris, or to keep the grease in as the stuff is spinning around.
The grease picks up dirt and debris.
Right.
Whereas the hell out of everything.
Yeah.
I imagine it gets extremely hot also. I mean, I guess if it's not, if 15 is top speed, but still that's a lot of friction and a lot of heat.
Yeah, a lot of grease will thin out and it'll really fly.
Not are you hung up in gears or probably seared as well?
So we get to the Heislers, and as I said, this one was built from the ground up by an engineer, and he enclosed the gears, so they were constantly lubricated, so that was a big improvement. And you can see the cylinders. This was taken on Tionesta Valley Railroad. About a mile below the big fill at what's the name of that run? I can't think of it. So this was a Collins locomotive. I don't forget the tonnage on it, but as I said, you know, they didn't use the real big ones around here. Although this was a Heisler, it was called the Big Four. Okay, yeah, take a good look at it. This was the Big Four after it lost its brakes. Believe it or not, that thing was repaired and put back into service. Yeah, they actually put that thing back together. And nobody was hurt in that. Amazingly, nobody was hurt. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, you can see it from different photos. I mean, the side, how small this thing is. You know, Heisler didn't have they didn't have classes. I mean, they had different tonnage size, but they didn't designate classes. So the The shades were built from 1880 to 1945. The Heislers, the last one was outshopped in 1941. The last one built to Heisler patent was built in 1945 in New Zealand. See, by the 1920s, the market for these had dropped off. It was nothing like it used to be. So, all these companies were having, they were slowing down. And this is the reason why. This was, these were replacing. Plus, in this area in particular, there were by the early 20s, there was no more. The big woods didn't exist anymore. It was pretty much all cut down. This was a wasteland. But this is what ultimately killed the geared locomotive market off.
What year would we be talking? The 40s, is that what you said?
Here, yeah, probably. I don't know.
30s.
30. I'd say 30. Yeah, from that truck, I'd say the 30s. And my grandfather had trucks similar to that, and they used to run them in the 1930s. I've seen photos, and yeah, it's kind of that kind of style. Climax was actually the first one to go out of business. They went out in 1928. And they were bought out by an outfit called General Parts Corporation. What they specialized in, they bought defunct auto manufacturers and took over the parts business, and this is what they did with Climax. So when they took it over, there were like four locomotives in process on the shop floor. They finished them off, and those were the last Climaxes. But just imagine, those things used to run all over these hills, it's hard to believe.
So when they were done picking a hollow clean, they would pull the rails.
Pull the rails up, move them on to the next job. So like I said, yeah, a lot of times those logging spurs might only be there a month, or a few months. Some of them survived longer because they were functioning as like trunk lines, but
So that's why you find here and there a tie, but you don't find a lot of ties because they were just common lumber that they used for ties.
right.
Nothing treated, no ballast, no.
Yeah, well, they pull the ties up too, reuse those if they were sound enough. And a lot of these, like I showed some of those photos I showed of like the stringer roads and that. There's no sign of those left, and that was a popular method of building the logging spurs because it was really quick, and you didn't have minimum grading. So, as the mills in this area shut down, some of these times lumber moved on out to the West Coast, down into Western Maryland, West Virginia, Carolinas. Sometimes they took their locomotives with them. Most of the time these things were pretty hard usage and they were wore out. And this was the fate of a lot of them. This was in Kellyville. When the Collins Mill shut down, they stored them in the planing mill, and then the planing mill caught fire, and these things just sat out there. And rotted away, and most of them were picked up for scrap during World War II. Yeah, pretty sad. One thing that was salvaged off of these were the bells. Right?
Right here.
Yeah. Becky's uncle.
Grandfather. My grandfather
Yeah.
was really in the bells.
Yeah, he went around to these and took the bells off of these things. What,
Name the bell, he had it.
Yeah.
And there's one right here.
yeah.
Took the ringer out of it.
No, that one rings. You had it away.
Do you have an estimate
Pretty
of
astounding.
how many different locomotives at its peak was running in Forest County?
Well, that'd be quite a job. I mean, there's those railroad books, the logging railroad books. They have a roster in there, but I mean, you would have to like correlate the dates and everything. And yeah, I don't even want to think about it. But yeah, they came and they went, you know. But there are some survivors. So, I'm not sure. I think this is down in Cass in West Virginia. So, getting back to your comment about the quarry rails. There are some of these in museums. Pennsylvania Lumber Museum has a shay over there, and I went over there a couple weeks ago and videotaped it. And I was going to do a video presentation here, and that was the only type of locomotive I was able to videotape. The museum in Corey has a Climax B sitting up there. So I went up there last week, whatever. They wouldn't let me film.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah, they're afraid I'd make money off of it.
Oh.
Seriously, that's what they told me. You know, you would think a museum, they would be happy for the publicity, right?
Yeah, I would think.
That's it. No, they said nope. So anyhow, I had contacted the Corey Rail guys. I had contacted them. So I went down to talk to them, and that may have been why they won't let me film at the museum, because there's something going on between those two organizations. But anyhow, Corey Rails is a group of mostly ex-Seabees. For some reason, there was a bunch of Seabees from the Corey area, and these guys are all retired, and they got together and they started collecting stuff, and they got the idea of finding a Climax locomotive to restore. Well, they found a Climax A. It was originally in Nome, Alaska. Okay, and it was the only complete one known to still be in existence. And I should have included some photos from that. That was quite a, they got it back to Corey, but that was an epic thing. This thing has sat at a gold mine, abandoned gold mine about 85 miles from Nome for I don't know how many years. 1910, probably about 50, 60 years. And when a lot of this place mines and that up in Alaska and Canada, when they shut down, it wasn't worth bringing the equipment out. They just left it. So this Climax was left there. In the 1960s, one of the Nome residents decided he was going to go rescue it and restore it. 85 miles. He drove a bulldozer 85 miles, put this thing on a sled, drove it 85 miles back to Nome. Okay. And then he didn't do anything with it. It just sat there. It sat there for several years, and he passed away. And then a guy from the Anchorage area found out about it, and he went and got it. And getting it to Anchorage was, well, he was in Palmer, several miles outside of Anchorage. So they put it on a barge. It was a Nome. They put it on a barge. They shipped it down to Bethel, Alaska. They had to put it on another barge. There wasn't a direct. They couldn't go directly to Anchorage. They had to take it to Seattle, put it on another barge, bring it back to Anchorage. Then he took this thing. It's an 18-ton locomotive. It weighs 36,000 pounds. He put it on a flatbed trailer and pulled it with his 3/4 ton pickup truck.
He missed the DOT, didn't he?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't buy used trucks from this guy, okay? So he dismantled it, he started restoration, but he never finished it, he passed away, so these Corey guys found out about it, they did about 3 years of negotiation, they finally got it. They went up there, this thing is in, okay, I said it was the only complete one, well, it's not intact, it's in like 4,000 pieces in all these crates, he had dismantled it. Some of the stuff he marked, some of it he didn't. All the prints for this locomotive have disappeared. They have no prints for this thing. So they got this shop, they have this all these parts spread out in there, and they're trying to figure out how to put it back together, just working off of photographs and intuition. And but I was there, I must have been there 4 or 5 hours with talking to those guys and filming. And I'm going to make a video of that. And I'm going to make a video of that and put it on my YouTube channel. So I'm not sure when, but they've it's quite the project. And well, they about 3 years, and they need donations. They're having a new. They're having to have a new boiler built, and the build that it's going to be a reproduction because the old one is not fixable. Okay, he said $180,000 to build a new boiler. So, yeah, I think it's a good cause. If you want-
Check there.
yeah. Send them some money.
Okay,